The rainstorm was so fierce that the winding road through the Georgia swamps nearly vanished beneath sheets of water and fog. Then the retired Navy SEAL's German Shepherd suddenly barked. Sharp, urgent, wrong. Seconds later, Jack Sullivan slammed on the brakes beside a flooded marsh. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of old coats tangled in the reeds. But when the headlights swept across the figure, Jack felt his heart stop. An elderly veteran lay half submerged in the freezing mud, bruised, bleeding, and barely alive. Someone hadn't simply abandoned him in the storm. Someone had made sure he would never see Christmas morning. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a cold Georgia rain that seemed determined to wash the world away. Thick fog drifted over the endless marshes outside Savannah, turning the dark landscape into a maze of shadows and silver mist. The narrow county road stretched through the wetlands like a ribbon disappearing into nowhere. Jack Sullivan tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his aging black pickup truck as rain hammered against the windshield. At 48 years old, the retired Navy SEAL still carried the habits that military service had carved into him decades earlier. His broad shoulders remained strong from years of hard work, and although streaks of gray had begun appearing in his dark hair, his sharp blue eyes missed very little. Since retiring from the Navy 8 years earlier, Jack had built a quiet life on a small farm outside Savannah. He raised horses, repaired equipment for neighboring ranches, and spent most of his time avoiding the crowds that never seemed to understand why some men preferred silence. Sitting beside him was Titan, a 9-year-old German Shepherd whose black and tan coat still looked impressive, despite the gray beginning to spread around his muzzle. Titan had served beside Jack during several overseas deployments. The dog was intelligent, fiercely loyal, and possessed instincts that Jack trusted more than most people. The heater hummed softly inside the truck while Christmas songs played faintly through the radio. Normally Jack enjoyed the peaceful drive home, but tonight, his thoughts kept returning to his daughter Emily. Earlier that afternoon she had called him while trying to sound stronger than she felt. Emily Sullivan was 32 years old, and had spent the last 2 years rebuilding her life after losing her husband Aaron to a sudden illness. The loss had changed her. Before Aaron's death she had been cheerful and carefree. Now she carried a quiet determination that came from surviving hardship. She worked long hours at a local accounting office while raising her son Michael alone. The medical bills left behind by Aaron's treatment still arrived every month, creating a burden she rarely discussed. Michael, now 20 years old, attended community college while working evening shifts at a grocery store. Jack admired the young man's work ethic, but worried about how much responsibility had fallen onto his shoulders so early in life. Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood upright. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Jack immediately stopped thinking about family finances. He knew that growl. It was not curiosity. It was warning. "What is it, buddy?" Titan stared through the passenger window into the darkness. The growl deepened. Then he barked sharply and slammed one paw against the glass. Jack slowed the truck. Rain continued pouring from the sky while fog swirled across the road ahead. Most people would have seen nothing, but Titan never reacted without reason. The truck crawled forward another 100 feet before Jack noticed something unusual near the edge of the swamp. At first it appeared to be nothing more than a pile of discarded blankets tangled among reeds and muddy brush. Then Titan barked again, louder this time. Jack immediately pulled onto the shoulder. "Stay close." He grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the cold rain. Water soaked through his jacket almost instantly. Titan jumped out beside him and moved ahead with purposeful urgency. The muddy ground shifted beneath their feet as they approached the shape. When Jack's flashlight beam finally settled on it, his stomach tightened. It wasn't debris. It was a man. An elderly man lay partially submerged in mud and standing water only a few feet from the swamp. His clothes were soaked. One shoe was missing. His silver hair clung to his forehead, while rainwater streamed down his pale face. Titan reached him first and pressed his nose against the man's neck. A soft whine escaped the dog's throat. Alive, barely. Jack dropped to one knee. The man looked somewhere in his 70s. Deep wrinkles lined his face and his frame appeared, thin beneath the ruined clothing. Several dark bruises covered his arms and neck. These were not injuries caused by a simple fall. Somebody had hurt him. Jack carefully checked for a pulse, weak but present. As he adjusted the soaked coat, something metallic slipped free from beneath the fabric. A military medal attached to a faded ribbon. The sight immediately caught Jack's attention. Whoever this man was, he had once served his country. Jack slipped the medal into his pocket for safekeeping before lifting the old man into his arms. Titan remained glued to their side the entire walk back to the truck. Twice the dog stopped and looked into the darkness behind them as if expecting someone to emerge from the fog. The behavior unsettled Jack more than he cared to admit. 40 minutes later, the truck pulled into the driveway of the Sullivan farm. Warm yellow light glowed from the farmhouse windows. Emily's car sat parked beside the barn. Jack carried the unconscious stranger through the front door. Emily rushed from the kitchen immediately. Her shoulder-length brown hair was tied back and exhaustion lingered beneath her eyes, despite her attempt to hide it. "Dad, what happened?" she asked. "Found him in the swamp." Michael appeared moments later from the dining room where textbooks and notebooks covered the table. Tall and lean like his late father, he quickly moved aside to help clear space near the fireplace. Together they wrapped the old man in blankets, while Emily prepared hot water and dry towels. Titan positioned himself beside the stranger and refused to move. Hours passed. Rain battered the roof while wind rattled the windows. Christmas Day arrived quietly at midnight. The old man remained unconscious, though his breathing slowly strengthened. Jack sat nearby watching the fire. Emily reviewed another stack of medical bills at the kitchen table, occasionally rubbing her temples. Michael worked on a college assignment, while pretending not to worry about the family's finances. For a brief moment, Jack wished he could solve all of their problems the way he used to solve missions overseas. Unfortunately, real life rarely offered simple solutions. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the old man's fingers twitched. Titan immediately stood. Everyone looked up. Slowly, the stranger's eyes opened. Confusion filled them at first, then terror. The old man suddenly tried to sit upright despite obvious pain. His breathing became frantic. His eyes darted around the room searching for something unseen. "Easy," Jack said calmly. "You're safe." The man stared at him. Fear flooded every line of his weathered face. His lips trembled. Then he grabbed Jack's sleeve with surprising strength and whispered a sentence so filled with panic that the entire room fell silent. "Don't let them find me." Morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds hanging low over the marshlands outside Savannah. The storm had passed during the night, but puddles covered the dirt roads and mist still drifted between the cypress trees surrounding the Sullivan farm. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of fresh coffee and wood smoke filled the air while the old grandfather clock in the hallway quietly marked the passing hours. Jack Sullivan sat near the fireplace watching the elderly stranger, who had nearly died in the swamp only hours earlier. Titan remained beside the couch, stretched across the floor with his head resting near the old man's hand. Every now and then the German shepherd lifted his ears and studied the stranger carefully before settling down again. The dog seemed unusually protective, something Jack had learned never to ignore. The old man slowly opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. For a few moments confusion clouded his face before memory returned. His breathing quickened slightly, but unlike the panic from the night before, he remained calm enough to look around the room. Emily entered carrying a tray with toast, eggs, and a steaming mug of tea. At 32 years old, she looked older than her age some mornings. Losing her husband Aaron to illness 2 years earlier had changed her in ways she rarely discussed. The burden of raising Michael alone while struggling beneath a mountain of medical debt had left permanent traces of exhaustion behind her smile. "You're awake," she said gently. The old man nodded. His voice sounded weak. "Where am I?" "My farm," Jack replied. "Outside Savannah." The stranger stared into the fire for several seconds before noticing the military medal resting on a nearby table. His expression immediately changed, sadness mixed with recognition. Jack picked up the medal and handed it to him. The old man's fingers trembled as he accepted it. "Silver Star," Jack said quietly. "Not many people earn one of these." The stranger lowered his eyes. "Sometimes surviving feels harder than earning it." Michael entered carrying a laptop under one arm. At 20 years old, he was tall, thoughtful, and carried much of his late father's quiet kindness. College classes, part-time work, and helping his mother manage bills had forced him to mature quickly. He glanced toward the old man before setting the computer on the table. "I searched some military records this morning," Michael said. "I think I know who you are." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. Michael turned the screen around. An old photograph appeared. A younger version of the stranger stood among a group of soldiers in desert uniforms. Several military vehicles sat behind them beneath a blazing Middle Eastern sun. The old man's shoulders sank. That was a lifetime ago. Jack looked from the screen back to him. "Robert Walker." The old man slowly nodded. Silence settled across the room. Jack recognized the name immediately. Robert Walker had once been a respected Gulf War veteran who occasionally appeared at military events throughout Georgia. Years ago, he had spoken about leadership, sacrifice, and caring for fellow veterans. Then one day he had simply vanished from public life. "I remember hearing your name," Jack said. Robert gave a faint smile that disappeared almost instantly. "Most people don't anymore." Titan rose and gently pushed his head beneath Robert's hand. The old veteran absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur. Something about the interaction softened his expression. "I used to have a dog," he whispered, "a shepherd named Duke." For a brief moment warmth returned to his eyes. "He stayed with me through everything." Emily sat across from him. "What happened?" Robert stared into the fire. "Old age." His voice cracked slightly. "That's the problem with loyal friends, they never stay long enough." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Jack leaned forward. "Robert, who were you running from?" The old veteran looked away. The warmth vanished immediately. Fear returned. Not the fear of a frightened man. The fear of someone who had learned through experience that danger was real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. A smiling woman stood beside him. Her hair was silver, and her eyes carried the kind of kindness that made strangers feel welcome. "Margaret," he said softly, "my wife." Robert explained that they had spent 43 years together. She had survived deployments, relocations, financial struggles, and every challenge military life could create. When cancer claimed her life 3 years earlier, Robert found himself completely alone for the first time. The loneliness gradually consumed him. Friends stopped visiting, neighbors moved away. The house became quieter every year. That was when Ethan Brooks entered the picture. "My nephew," Robert said. "At least that's what I always called him." Ethan was in his mid-30s, ambitious, well-dressed, and extremely persuasive. After losing both parents at a young age, he had developed a habit of chasing success wherever he could find it. Robert had helped pay for parts of Ethan's education years earlier. He treated him almost like a son. "At first he was wonderful," Robert continued. "He brought groceries, drove me to appointments, helped with paperwork." Emily listened carefully. The story sounded familiar. Too familiar. Robert explained that Ethan gradually took over more responsibilities: banking, insurance, medical forms, tax records. Eventually, Ethan convinced him to move into a veteran care facility called Liberty Haven. According to Ethan, the center specialized in helping aging veterans manage PTSD, health problems, and daily living needs. "He said I'd be safer there," Robert said. "Said I shouldn't live alone anymore." Michael frowned. "And was it?" Robert's face darkened. At first, he described clean hallways, friendly staff, and organized activities during the first few months. Everything seemed normal. Then small things began happening. Residents suddenly disappeared. Certain veterans stopped attending meals. Questions were ignored. Medical treatments increased without explanation. Some residents became heavily medicated. Others signed legal documents they barely understood. Jack noticed Robert's hands trembling. Titan immediately moved closer. The old veteran rested one hand against the dog's neck. "The place changes people," Robert whispered. "Or maybe it hides what people become." While Robert spoke, Emily's attention drifted toward a folder sitting on the kitchen counter. Earlier that morning she had been sorting through old paperwork left behind after Aaron's illness. Something had bothered her for months. Several medical charges appeared repeatedly throughout different statements. The same billing codes, the same providers, the same unexplained fees. At first she assumed it was administrative confusion. Now she wasn't so sure. She retrieved the folder and began comparing documents while the others talked. A few minutes later her expression changed. "Dad." Jack looked over. Emily handed him several pages. "Look at these." Jack studied the statements. Multiple charges appeared from companies he had never heard of. Some dated back years before Aaron became sick. Others appeared shortly after hospital visits involving elderly relatives. Michael leaned closer. "That's strange." Emily nodded. "These companies keep showing up." Robert's eyes widened slightly when he saw one of the names. "I've seen that before." Everyone turned toward him. "Where?" Jack asked. Robert swallowed hard. "Liberty Haven." The room suddenly felt colder. Robert slowly sat upright despite the discomfort. The fear returned to his face. "There were forms," he said quietly. "Stacks of forms." His eyes drifted toward the window, as though remembering something he wished he could forget. People signed them because they trusted the staff, trusted the lawyers, trusted the administrators. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. Then they disappeared. Nobody spoke. Even the crackling fire seemed distant. Robert looked directly at Jack. Fear and sorrow filled his tired eyes. Then he delivered the sentence that had haunted him since escaping Liberty Haven. A lot of veterans disappeared after signing those papers. The morning after Robert Walker revealed that veterans had disappeared. After signing documents at Liberty Haven, a heavy silence settled over the Sullivan farm. Dark clouds drifted across the Georgia sky while cold winds moved through the oak trees surrounding the property. Jack Sullivan stood on the front porch holding a cup of coffee and staring toward the distant marshlands. His instincts, sharpened by decades as a Navy SEAL, told him that Robert's story was only the beginning of something much larger. Inside the farmhouse, Titan paced restlessly across the living room. The German Shepherd had behaved strangely since sunrise. Every few minutes he returned to the old military coat Robert had worn when Jack found him in the swamp. The dog sniffed the fabric intensely before growling low in his throat. Then he would circle the room and return to the coat again. Jack noticed the pattern immediately. Titan rarely obsessed over anything unless there was a reason. Robert sat quietly near the fireplace watching the dog. The old veteran looked stronger than he had the previous day, but exhaustion still lingered in his face. Deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. Years of fear and loneliness had left marks that healing would not erase quickly. "He's trying to tell us something," Robert said softly. Jack nodded. "I think so too." Titan suddenly barked once and pawed aggressively at one sleeve of the coat. Jack picked it up and examined the fabric. At first he noticed nothing unusual. Then he detected a faint chemical odor beneath the scent of mud and swamp water. It was subtle but distinct. Robert's expression darkened. "That smell." He swallowed hard. "They used something similar at Liberty Haven." The room fell silent. Jack carefully folded the coat and set it aside. Whatever Liberty Haven was, it clearly wasn't an ordinary care facility. An hour later, Jack walked into his office and pulled out an old contact book he had not opened in years. Some numbers remained unchanged no matter how much time passed. He made 3 phone calls. By noon, 3 trucks rolled onto the Sullivan property. The first man to step out was Ryan Carter. At 50 years old, Ryan was a former SEAL medic with broad shoulders, weathered features, and a calm personality that made people trust him immediately. Years spent saving wounded teammates had taught him patience and compassion. The second arrival was Marcus Hayes, a lean 46-year-old former intelligence specialist, who rarely spoke more than necessary. His sharp eyes missed very little, and years of covert work had made him naturally suspicious. The last man was Luke Bennett, a former breacher known throughout his SEAL unit for his humor and loyalty. At 49, Luke still possessed the energy of someone much younger, despite carrying scars from multiple deployments. The reunion was brief. These men were not the type to waste time on formalities. Once they heard Robert's story, the atmosphere changed immediately. Ryan sat beside Robert and quietly reviewed his injuries, while Marcus asked careful questions about Liberty Haven. Luke listened from the kitchen table with his arms folded across his chest. "You believe they hurt veterans?" Luke finally asked. Robert stared into the fire. "I know they did." Nobody spoke for several moments. Men like Ryan, Marcus, Luke, and Jack understood what service meant. They understood sacrifice. The idea of elderly veterans being abused inside a facility supposedly created to protect them felt like a personal betrayal. "Then we find out what's happening," Marcus said simply. The others nodded. Meanwhile, across town, Michael Sullivan began his first day as an intern at the Savannah Chronicle. The local newspaper occupied an aging brick building near the waterfront district. Michael felt nervous as he stepped inside carrying a notebook and laptop. Most of the reporters moved quickly between desks while phones rang constantly in the background. The editor assigned him to assist a young investigative journalist named Sarah Collins. Sarah was 28 years old, ambitious, and known throughout the newsroom for chasing stories other reporters avoided. Several years earlier, her father had lost his retirement savings in an investment scam. The experience had shaped her career. Since then, she had focused almost exclusively on exposing financial fraud and corruption. She greeted Michael with a quick smile before handing him a stack of documents. "You know spreadsheets?" she asked. "I survived accounting classes." Sarah laughed. "Good enough." Throughout the afternoon, they reviewed financial records connected to various businesses throughout Georgia. Michael quickly discovered that Sarah possessed an unusual ability to spot patterns hidden within ordinary paperwork. She noticed inconsistencies that most people overlooked. Late in the day, their conversation shifted toward elderly financial abuse. Michael hesitated before mentioning Liberty Haven. "Have you ever heard of it?" Sarah stopped typing. Her expression changed slightly. "Why? Just curious." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "A few years ago, someone tried reporting them." Michael's attention sharpened immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing." Sarah frowned. "The story disappeared before publication." That answer bothered her even now, after Michael left for the evening. Sarah remained at her desk. Curiosity had always been both her greatest strength and greatest weakness. She opened several archived databases and began searching old records. Hours passed. Outside, darkness settled over Savannah while rain began falling again. Back at the Sullivan farm, Jack and his teammates gathered around the dining room table reviewing everything Robert could remember. Titan continued returning to the military coat. The dog seemed unable to let it go. Marcus carefully documented names, dates, and locations. Ryan reviewed medical records. Luke searched public information connected to Liberty Haven. Slowly, a disturbing picture began forming. Then Marcus found something unusual. Several public complaints had been filed against Liberty Haven over the years. Most involved financial misconduct, unexplained medical treatments, or missing residents. Yet every complaint ended the same way: closed, withdrawn, unresolved. No investigations, no prosecutions. Nothing. "That's not normal," Marcus muttered. Across town, Sarah finally found the same pattern. One complaint became 3, 3 became 8, 8 became 15, elder abuse allegations, financial fraud accusations, reports from former employees, anonymous tips, missing paperwork, disappearing witnesses. Every trail abruptly ended. Sarah stared at the screen. Her pulse quickened. Then she opened one final archived folder buried deep within an older database. What she found made her sit upright. Liberty Haven had been accused repeatedly over nearly a decade. The accusations were serious enough to trigger investigations. Yet every investigative file had somehow vanished before reaching court. Sarah immediately grabbed her phone and called Michael. The moment he answered, she spoke. "Michael, I found something." "What?" Sarah looked at the growing list on her screen. Liberty Haven has been reported over and over again for years. She paused. A chill ran through her. And every single file disappeared. 3 days after Sarah Collins uncovered the missing investigation files connected to Liberty Haven, the atmosphere at the Sullivan farm had changed completely. What had begun as the rescue of an injured veteran from a Georgia swamp was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous. Rain clouds drifted across the winter sky, while cold winds swept through the fields surrounding Jack Sullivan's property. Inside the farmhouse, maps, notebooks, laptops, and printed documents covered the dining room table. Robert Walker sat quietly near the fireplace, watching the activity unfold around him. Although some strength had returned to his body, the memories of Liberty Haven seemed to grow heavier each day. Every new discovery confirmed his worst fears. Across the table, Marcus Hayes studied a blueprint of Liberty Haven displayed on a laptop screen. Years earlier, Marcus had served as an intelligence specialist within a Navy SEAL unit. His calm demeanor often made people underestimate him, but his greatest strength had always been patience. He believed every secret eventually revealed itself if someone looked long enough. Beside him, Ryan Carter reviewed medical reports while Luke Bennett monitored security footage gathered from publicly available sources. Titan lay beneath the table with his head resting on his paws, though the German Shepherd remained alert to every conversation. "We need eyes inside," Marcus finally said. Nobody disagreed. The information they possessed was troubling, but none of it would survive serious scrutiny without evidence. Liberty Haven continued operating because nobody had ever managed to prove what happened behind its carefully maintained image. Jack folded his arms. "Can you get in?" Marcus nodded. "I've done harder things." 2 mornings later, a white service van rolled through the front gate of Liberty Haven. The facility appeared impressive from the outside. Fresh paint covered the buildings. Decorative gardens lined the walkways. American flags waved beside neatly trimmed hedges. Families visiting loved ones would likely see comfort, security, and professionalism. Marcus saw something else. He saw layers. Layers existed wherever people worked hard to hide the truth, dressed in a technician's uniform and carrying a toolbox. Marcus entered the facility using forged maintenance paperwork that Ryan had helped prepare. The receptionist barely glanced at him before directing him toward a maintenance corridor. Everything seemed ordinary at first. Elderly veterans moved through common areas. Nurses smiled politely. Holiday decorations still hung from the ceilings. Yet within an hour, Marcus noticed something unusual. Most residents appeared heavily medicated. Their movements seemed slow. Conversations drifted aimlessly. Some stared blankly at television screens without reacting to anything around them. One veteran sitting alone near a window caught Marcus's attention. The man wore an old Marine Corps cap and looked to be in his late 70s. His name tag identified him as Harold Jenkins. The moment Marcus approached, the old veteran grabbed his wrist unexpectedly. "Don't let them move me," Harold whispered. His voice trembled. Before Marcus could respond, a nurse appeared. She quickly guided Harold away while offering an apologetic smile. The interaction lasted only seconds. It was enough. Marcus continued working through hallways and utility rooms, while secretly documenting everything with a hidden camera. By midday, he discovered an area not shown on public facility maps. A secured corridor sat behind a keypad, protected door near the medical wing. Staff entered regularly. Residents never did. Marcus managed to gain access when an employee exited carrying supplies. What he found beyond the door made his stomach tighten. Several small rooms lined the hallway. Inside sat elderly veterans. Most appeared disoriented. Some slept heavily despite the middle of the day. Others stared blankly at walls. Medical charts hanging outside the rooms revealed unusually high dosages of sedative medications. Marcus photographed everything. In one room he found an elderly Army veteran named Walter Green. Walter was 81 years old, and physically frail but still mentally alert. He had once served as a helicopter mechanic during Vietnam. Years of caring for his disabled wife before her death had shaped him into a deeply patient man. When Marcus quietly introduced himself, Walter glanced nervously toward the hallway. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Why?" Walter's eyes filled with fear. "Because they watch everyone." Before Marcus could ask more, footsteps approached. He quickly resumed his role as a technician and left the area. Back at the farm, Emily Sullivan spent her afternoon sorting through boxes stored in the attic. She had originally gone searching for old tax documents. Instead, she discovered several folders belonging to her late mother, Rachel Sullivan. Rachel had passed away nearly 10 years earlier after a long battle with heart disease. Known throughout the community for her generosity, Rachel spent years volunteering with veteran organizations. Emily smiled sadly as she opened the boxes. Many contained photographs, handwritten notes, and letters from families Rachel had helped. Then she found something unexpected, a folder labeled Walker Veterans Outreach Foundation. Emily frowned. She had never heard of it. Inside were bank records, donation receipts, and legal paperwork. As she reviewed the documents, confusion quickly turned into concern. Years earlier, Rachel had established a charitable fund dedicated to helping elderly veterans pay medical expenses. The account had once contained nearly $400,000 collected through donations and fundraising events. Emily searched through page after page. The money had vanished. Large transfers appeared over a period of several years. The destinations were unfamiliar corporations with generic names. None appeared connected to veteran services. Her pulse quickened. One company name immediately stood out: Liberty Management Services. Emily stared at the document. She had seen the same company listed within suspicious medical billing records days earlier. The discovery sent a chill through her. That evening, Marcus returned to the farm shortly after sunset. Nobody needed to ask how the mission had gone. His expression said enough. The team gathered around the dining room table while Marcus transferred files from his hidden camera. Robert sat nearby with Titan resting beside his chair. One by one, the images appeared across the laptop screen. At first, there were photographs of restricted hallways and secured medical wings. Then came medication charts showing unusually high dosages. Then isolated rooms filled with heavily sedated veterans. Nobody spoke. The silence grew heavier with every image. Ryan's face darkened as he reviewed the medical records. Luke stared at the screen in disbelief. Jack felt anger building inside his chest. These men had served their country. They deserved dignity. Not this. Then Marcus opened the final folder. Several photographs appeared showing elderly veterans sitting alone in locked rooms. One image captured an old Marine staring through a small reinforced window. Another showed medication logs with signatures that appeared forged. A third revealed financial records connected directly to resident accounts. Robert's hands began trembling. He recognized some of the faces. Men he had once eaten breakfast with. Men who had suddenly disappeared. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute. Finally, Marcus looked up from the laptop. "This isn't a care facility anymore," he said quietly. "It's a prison." Nobody argued, because the images glowing across the screen had left them all staring in stunned silence. 2 nights after Marcus Hayes returned from Liberty Haven with evidence that shook everyone at the Sullivan farm, sleep became a rare luxury. The images of isolated veterans, heavily medicated residents, and suspicious medical records lingered in every conversation. Outside, winter winds swept across the Georgia marshlands. while clouds drifted beneath a pale moon. Inside the farmhouse, Jack Sullivan sat alone at the dining table studying photographs from Marcus's hidden camera. Titan rested nearby, though the German Shepherd had become increasingly restless over the past several days. Ever since the team began investigating Liberty Haven, the dog seemed unable to settle for long. Shortly after midnight, Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood straight. Without warning, he walked to the front door and stared toward the darkness outside. Jack immediately noticed. "What is it, buddy?" Titan whined softly before pawing at the door. Jack grabbed a flashlight and a jacket. The German Shepherd rarely behaved this way without reason. Moments later, they stepped into the cold night. The air smelled of wet earth and distant rain. Titan moved with unusual determination, crossing the yard before heading toward Jack's truck. Within minutes, they were driving down a rural road that bordered the rear section of Liberty Haven's property. Jack had visited the area several times since Marcus's infiltration, trying to understand the layout of the facility and its surrounding land. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead. Suddenly the dog barked sharply. Jack slowed. A narrow dirt path disappeared into a cluster of trees behind Liberty Haven. Titan barked again. Jack followed the path. About half a mile later, the headlights illuminated an old wooden structure hidden among dense vegetation. It looked abandoned. The roof sagged in several places and vines crawled across the walls. Yet something felt wrong. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud leading directly toward the building. Jack parked and stepped outside with Titan close beside him. The German Shepherd immediately pulled toward the structure. The old warehouse smelled of mold, dust, and something else. Smoke. Not fresh smoke, but recent enough to leave traces behind. Jack carefully entered through a partially broken side door. His flashlight beam swept across stacks of old filing cabinets, damaged shelves, and cardboard boxes scattered throughout the building. Titan moved quickly toward a far corner and began scratching at the floor. Jack approached. Several metal barrels stood nearby. Inside lay partially burned documents. Hundreds of pages. Someone had tried destroying them. Jack knelt and carefully removed several sheets that had escaped the flames. Medical records, prescription logs, financial statements. Many names belonged to Liberty Haven residents. His pulse quickened. Then he found something even more troubling. A thick binder hidden beneath a collapsed shelf. Inside were spreadsheets listing property holdings, retirement accounts, life insurance policies, and bank balances belonging to dozens of veterans. Beside many names appeared handwritten notes. Some entries included dates, others contained account transfer information. Jack photographed every page. Titan continued searching the warehouse. Moments later, the dog discovered another box hidden beneath a tarp. This one contained personal belongings, military medals, family photographs, wedding rings, letters. The kind of items families usually inherited after a loved one passed away. Yet many appeared untouched, abandoned. Forgotten. Back in Savannah, Sarah Collins sat alone inside the newsroom of the Savannah Chronicle. Most reporters had gone home hours earlier. Only the glow of computer screens illuminated the nearly empty office. The deeper Sarah investigated Ethan Brooks. The stranger the story became. Ethan officially worked as a consultant for several healthcare management companies. Public records suggested an ordinary middle-class lifestyle. Reality told a different story. Sarah had spent the past 2 days tracing property ownership records across multiple counties. What she discovered made no sense. Ethan owned 3 luxury waterfront homes, 2 commercial buildings in Atlanta, several undeveloped parcels of land, a private investment account containing millions of dollars. Yet no legitimate income source explained how he had acquired any of it. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Her father had spent years warning people about financial predators. Before losing his retirement savings in an elaborate fraud scheme, he often said greed always left footprints. Most criminals believed money erased those footprints. In reality, it simply created new ones. Sarah opened another file, This one connected several companies receiving transfers from charitable foundations, veteran trusts, and estate settlements. One name appeared repeatedly: Liberty Management Services, the same company Emily had discovered in her late mother's missing charity fund records. Sarah stared at the screen. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Jack returned carrying boxes of evidence from the warehouse. Marcus, Ryan, Luke, Emily, Michael, and Robert gathered around the dining room table, while Jack explained what Titan had found. The old veteran listened quietly. Every new discovery seemed to age him another year. Marcus immediately began organizing documents. Ryan reviewed medical files. Luke photographed everything for backup records. Emily carefully examined financial ledgers. Then Robert noticed something familiar. That binder. Everyone looked up. Robert pointed toward the thick property ledger recovered from the warehouse. "I've seen it before." Silence filled the room. Robert explained that several residents at Liberty Haven often discussed their families, savings, and military pensions. Shortly afterward, administrators would request updated paperwork. Within months, some residents disappeared. Staff always provided explanations: relocations, medical transfers, hospice care. Yet nobody ever received details. Nobody ever saw them again. Marcus slowly opened the binder. Deceased. Deceased. The room grew quiet as they turned page after page. Then Michael stopped. "Wait." His voice sounded different. Everyone looked toward him. Michael pointed at one entry. For a moment, nobody spoke. Robert Walker. Date of death recorded 6 months earlier. Estate status: processed. Asset transfer. The room froze. Robert stared at the page. His face lost all color. Emily covered her mouth. Ryan swore under his breath. Jack felt cold anger settle inside his chest, because the man sitting only a few feet away had supposedly been dead for half a year. Marcus slowly looked up from the binder. Nobody needed to explain what that meant. Somewhere inside Liberty Haven, someone had officially declared Robert Walker dead, while he was still very much alive. The discovery of Robert Walker's name inside a list of deceased residents changed everything. The atmosphere inside the Sullivan farmhouse grew heavier as winter rain tapped softly against the windows and cold winds moved through the oak trees outside. For several minutes after Marcus revealed the document, nobody spoke. Robert sat frozen in his chair, staring at the page as though it belonged to someone else. Titan lay beside him, resting his head against the old veteran's leg as if sensing the storm of emotions moving through the room. Jack Sullivan watched Robert carefully. During his years as a Navy SEAL, he had seen men carry unbearable memories. He recognized the look in Robert's eyes. Fear was no longer the dominant emotion. It was betrayal, the kind that cut deeper because it came from someone trusted. Finally, Robert exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "I think it's time you hear everything," he said quietly. The room fell silent. Ryan Carter closed the medical files. Marcus stopped organizing evidence. Luke Bennett pulled his chair closer to the table. Emily and Michael sat beside one another while Sarah Collins joined them through a video call from the newspaper office. Robert stared into the fireplace for several seconds before beginning. He explained that after moving into Liberty Haven, life initially seemed comfortable. The facility organized activities, medical care, and social events. Most residents were elderly veterans with few remaining family members. Some had children living across the country. Others had nobody left at all. Many suffered from declining health. They trusted the staff completely. That trust eventually became their greatest vulnerability. Robert described a resident named Frank Delaney. Frank had been a retired Air Force mechanic in his late 70s. A cheerful man with thinning white hair, and a habit of carrying photographs of his grandchildren. After suffering a minor stroke, Frank became dependent on staff members for assistance. 1 month later, he signed several legal documents presented by administrators. Within weeks, he disappeared. Staff claimed he had transferred to another facility. Nobody ever heard from him again. Then there was Carl Jensen, a former Army sergeant who had survived Vietnam. Carl was stubborn, outspoken, and deeply suspicious of authority after experiences during the war shaped much of his personality. When Carl questioned unusual financial paperwork being distributed among residents, he suddenly began receiving stronger medications. Soon afterward, staff declared him mentally unstable. His complaints stopped. His visitors were restricted. Eventually, he vanished too. Robert lowered his eyes. There were dozens. Nobody interrupted. Robert continued explaining how Ethan Brooks gradually expanded his control. Ethan presented himself as a caring administrator focused on helping veterans. Behind the scenes, he built something entirely different. Residents with valuable assets became targets. Retirement funds, property deeds, life insurance policies, investment accounts, and charitable trusts were all carefully tracked. Those who lacked close family were considered ideal candidates. Ethan's network included lawyers, financial managers, and medical professionals willing to look the other way. Once a resident signed enough paperwork, ownership of assets quietly shifted through layers of corporations and holding companies. Anyone who resisted faced consequences. Some were heavily medicated, others were declared mentally incompetent after questionable evaluations. Once that label appeared in official records, few people questioned it. Most of them stopped fighting, Robert said, because nobody believed them anymore. Emily felt a chill move through her. She remembered the missing charity fund left behind by her mother. Rachel Sullivan had dedicated years of her life to helping veterans. Now it appeared her charitable foundation may have been pulled into the same system. Across the room, Michael studied Sarah's image on the laptop screen. Over the past week, they had spent countless hours sharing records, comparing documents, and investigating leads together. Their conversations often extended far beyond work. Sarah possessed a determination Michael admired. She had built her career exposing financial corruption after watching her own father lose everything to fraud years earlier. That experience had transformed her from an idealistic journalism student into someone who refused to ignore injustice. At the same time, Sarah appreciated Michael's steady nature. Unlike many people she encountered in investigative reporting, Michael listened more than he spoke. When he offered an opinion, it usually mattered. As Robert paused to rest, Sarah smiled slightly through the screen. "You should get some sleep eventually," she told Michael. That's rich coming from someone who's been awake for 16 hours. For the first time all evening, a few people laughed. Even Robert managed a faint smile. The brief moment of warmth helped relieve some of the tension hanging over the room. Later that night, Michael stepped onto the porch to get fresh air. A few minutes later, his phone vibrated. Sarah had sent a message. Simple, just a photograph of the newspaper office at midnight, and the caption, "Still hunting monsters." Michael found himself smiling. He replied with a picture of Titan sleeping beside Robert's chair. "Still guarding heroes." Sarah's response arrived almost immediately. "Maybe we're making a good team." Michael stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Maybe we are." Back inside, Robert continued reviewing documents with Jack and the others. Hours passed. Old memories surfaced gradually. Some were painful, others remained frustratingly incomplete. Then Robert froze while examining a photocopy of one financial ledger recovered from the warehouse. His eyes narrowed. He stared at a handwritten notation in the corner. A symbol, nothing more than a small triangle beside several account numbers. Yet it triggered something buried deep within his memory. Robert sat upright. "Wait." Everyone looked toward him. "What is it?" Jack asked. Robert's heartbeat quickened. Images began returning. A hallway, a locked office. Ethan arguing with another administrator late one night. A wall safe hidden behind a framed military painting. Robert rubbed his forehead as memories slowly connected. Before his attempted escape from Liberty Haven, he had accidentally overheard a conversation. Ethan believed no investigator would ever find the original records, because the most important evidence never remained in the facility's computer systems. Everything was duplicated and stored somewhere else, somewhere secure, somewhere nobody would think to search. Robert looked directly at Jack. Excitement and fear mixed in his eyes. "I remember now." The room immediately grew quiet. "Remember what?" Marcus asked. Robert slowly stood despite his age and exhaustion. Titan rose beside him. "There's a safe." He pointed toward the financial ledger. "A hidden safe." Jack exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Where?" Robert's voice trembled slightly. Not from fear this time, from hope. "I know where Ethan kept everything. Every property transfer, every forged document, every fake death certificate, the original records." He swallowed hard. "I remember where the safe is hidden." The storm arrived just before sunset. Dark clouds rolled across the Georgia sky and swallowed the last traces of daylight, while powerful winds swept through the marshlands surrounding Savannah. By evening, rain hammered rooftops, flooded dirt roads, and transformed the wetlands into a maze of mud, water, and darkness. Inside the Sullivan farmhouse, nobody paid much attention to the weather. Robert Walker's revelation about the hidden safe had changed everything. For the first time since his rescue, they finally had a chance to uncover proof capable of exposing Ethan Brooks and everyone connected to Liberty Haven. Jack Sullivan stood beside the dining room table studying an old hand-drawn map Robert had recreated from memory. The elderly veteran looked exhausted, but determination had replaced much of the fear that once dominated his expression. Titan sat beside him, watching every movement. The German shepherd seemed unusually alert, as though sensing that something important was about to happen. "The safe isn't inside Liberty Haven," Robert explained. "Ethan never trusted keeping the most valuable records there." Marcus Hayes leaned closer. "Then where?" Robert pointed toward a section of marshland located several miles behind the facility. "There used to be an old fishing lodge out there. Abandoned years ago after hurricane damage. Ethan purchased the property through another company." Luke Bennett frowned. "Why hide documents in a swamp?" Robert gave a bitter smile. "Because nobody looks for secrets in places everyone has forgotten." Within an hour, Jack, Marcus, Ryan Carter, Luke and Titan were moving through the storm in 2 trucks. Rain slammed against the windshields while lightning occasionally illuminated the flooded landscape. Robert remained behind at the farmhouse under Emily's watch. Nobody wanted him exposed if Ethan somehow learned he was alive. Unfortunately, someone already had. Across town, Ethan Brooks sat inside a luxurious office overlooking the Savannah River. At 36 years old, Ethan still projected the image of a successful businessman. Expensive suits, polished manners, and carefully chosen words had helped him manipulate countless people. But tonight, his calm exterior was beginning to crack. Earlier that afternoon, one of his contacts had reported unusual activity near the abandoned warehouse, where financial records had been stored. Then another source mentioned questions being asked about Liberty Haven. Ethan's instincts immediately warned him that someone was getting close. He stood near the window while rain streaked across the glass. "Move everything," he ordered into his phone. Tonight, several miles away, Emily Sullivan spent the evening inside the community center of a local church. While the investigation continued, she refused to abandon her mother's dream of helping veterans. Using social media and local contacts, Emily had organized a fundraising event for elderly veterans throughout the county. What began as a small gathering quickly attracted attention. Volunteers arrived carrying food. Local businesses donated supplies. Families brought clothing, blankets, and medical equipment. A retired school principal named Martha Green helped coordinate the event. Martha was a widowed 70-year-old known throughout the community for her tireless volunteer work. Years of supporting struggling families had made her fiercely protective of vulnerable people. Television crews soon arrived. Reporters interviewed veterans, volunteers, and donors. By nightfall, several local news stations were broadcasting coverage. Emily never expected such a response. Standing near the stage, She watched dozens of people helping one another despite the storm outside. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful. Meanwhile, Michael and Sarah Collins continued analyzing financial records from the newspaper office. Sarah's investigation into Ethan Brooks had already uncovered millions of dollars in unexplained assets. The deeper they searched, the more alarming the picture became. "Look at this," Sarah said. She pointed toward a collection of corporate filings displayed on her screen. Several shell companies shared the same mailing addresses, others connected directly to properties Ethan secretly controlled. Michael shook his head. "How did nobody notice this?" Sarah looked out the rain-covered window. "Maybe someone did." Back in the marshlands, Jack's team finally reached the abandoned fishing lodge shortly before midnight. The structure stood on a small patch of elevated ground surrounded by water and dense vegetation. Most of the building had collapsed years earlier, but part of the foundation remained intact. Titan immediately jumped from the truck. The German shepherd lowered his nose and began moving through the rain. "He's got something," Ryan said. Titan followed a scent trail around the side of the building. Suddenly he stopped and barked. Marcus shined his flashlight toward the ground. Fresh tire tracks. Very fresh. Luke crouched beside them. "Someone who's been here recently." The realization spread quickly through the group. They weren't the only ones searching. Jack entered the lodge while Marcus and Ryan searched outside. Beneath loose floorboards hidden inside one room, they discovered a concealed compartment. Inside sat a heavy steel safe. Robert had been right. For a brief moment, relief swept through the team. Then Marcus's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got company." Headlights appeared through the rain. Several vehicles moved along the narrow trail leading toward the lodge. Ethan's people had arrived. What followed was chaos. The storm intensified as both groups raced through the flooded marsh. Jack and Luke managed to remove the safe, but transporting it through knee-deep mud proved nearly impossible. Lightning flashed overhead while rain reduced visibility to only a few yards. Titan suddenly broke away from the group. "Titan!" Jack shouted. The dog ignored him, nose to the ground. Titan charged deeper into the swamp. Years of working together told Jack exactly what that meant. The German shepherd had found something more important than the safe. Jack followed. Marcus and Ryan stayed behind to secure the area, while Luke helped move the safe. Through wind, rain, and darkness, Titan continued tracking a scent. Several times he disappeared completely before reappearing farther ahead. Finally, the dog stopped near an isolated boathouse hidden among thick reeds. The structure looked abandoned from a distance, but Titan barked furiously at the door. Jack approached cautiously. Inside, stacked from floor to ceiling, were dozens of waterproof storage containers. Financial ledgers, property records, bank transfers, legal documents, hard drives, backup files, years of evidence. Far more than anyone expected. Ethan's men had apparently been moving the records before the storm interrupted them. Jack stared at the containers. Every piece of the operation, every stolen asset, every fraudulent transfer, everything. Titan looked back at him and barked once more. The old German shepherd stood soaked from head to tail, but his eyes remained fixed on the evidence hidden inside the boathouse. Jack smiled despite the storm, because after months of fear, lies, and missing records, Titan had finally found the place where Ethan Brooks had hidden the entire financial truth. Dawn arrived beneath dark storm clouds still lingering over coastal Georgia. The violent weather from the previous night had weakened, but tension hung over the Sullivan farmhouse heavier than any storm. Inside the dining room, dozens of waterproof containers recovered from the hidden boathouse covered every available surface. Financial ledgers, hard drives, property records, medical files, estate documents, and thousands of pages of evidence surrounded Jack Sullivan and his team. Titan rested near the fireplace after his exhausting night in the marshes, though the German shepherd remained alert whenever unfamiliar vehicles approached the property. At 9 years old, Titan had lost none of the instincts that once made him one of the most respected military working dogs in his unit. Jack looked around the room. Ryan Carter reviewed medical records. Marcus Hayes organized digital files. Luke Bennett photographed evidence for backup storage. Robert Walker sat quietly nearby, watching years of buried secrets finally emerge into the light. For the first time since his rescue, there was something new in the old veteran's eyes: hope. Sarah Collins arrived shortly after sunrise carrying her laptop and several external hard drives. The young investigative journalist had barely slept. Neither had Michael Sullivan. Over the past 12 hours they had worked side by side cataloging evidence recovered from the boathouse. The growing collection painted a picture even worse than anyone expected. Liberty Haven was not simply exploiting elderly veterans. It appeared to be the center of a sophisticated network designed to identify isolated residents, gain legal control over their finances, and quietly transfer their wealth through multiple shell corporations. "If this goes public," Sarah said while opening her laptop, "they won't be able to bury it again." Marcus nodded. "Then we make sure everyone sees it at the same time." That became the plan. Instead of handing evidence to a single agency and risking delays, Sarah proposed a coordinated release. The Savannah Chronicle would host a live broadcast. Supporting documents would be uploaded simultaneously to multiple news organizations, veteran advocacy groups, legal watchdog organizations, and federal agencies. Michael spent the morning preparing digital archives. Sarah coordinated with editors. By noon, dozens of journalists throughout the country had received confidential alerts about an emergency investigative report involving Liberty Haven. Meanwhile, Emily Sullivan continued reviewing financial records connected to her late mother's charitable foundation. The discovery of missing funds had troubled her deeply. Rachel Sullivan had devoted much of her life to helping struggling veterans. The possibility that her work had been exploited felt personal. Emily sat alone in the farmhouse office surrounded by boxes of old paperwork. She compared donation records against bank transfers and corporate filings. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Money from the Walker Veterans Outreach Foundation had not disappeared randomly. It had moved through multiple companies over several years. Each transfer created another layer of distance, another layer of protection. Most people would have stopped long before reaching the end of the trail. Emily didn't. She inherited her mother's stubbornness. Hours later, she finally reached the final destination. Her heart nearly stopped. Several transactions connected directly to a corporation Sarah had already linked to Ethan Brooks. Then another, and another. Nearly every missing dollar from her mother's foundation eventually flowed toward companies secretly controlled by Ethan's network. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. Her mother had spent years raising money to help veterans. Ethan had stolen it. Across town, Liberty Haven continued operating as though nothing had changed. Residents attended meals. Nurses moved through hallways. Administrators completed paperwork. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Several employees had already noticed unusual activity. One of them was Rachel Monroe, a 34-year-old nurse who had worked at Liberty Haven for 3 years. Rachel originally joined the facility believing she could help veterans. Over time, she witnessed things that troubled her, but fear kept her silent. Recently, she had begun documenting suspicious incidents in secret. That afternoon, she noticed senior administrators rushing between offices. Files disappeared from storage rooms. Phone calls became frantic. Security personnel increased throughout the building. Something was happening. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah Collins went live. Cameras inside the Savannah Chronicle newsroom broadcast directly across multiple platforms. Michael sat beside her operating the digital presentation. Thousands of viewers joined immediately. Then tens of thousands. Sarah began calmly. She introduced Robert Walker's story. She displayed evidence proving he had been declared dead despite being alive. She revealed medical records showing excessive medication use among residents. Then came the financial documents, property transfers, fraudulent legal filings, shell corporations, estate seizures, hidden bank accounts. One revelation after another. Every claim was supported by documents visible on screen. Michael uploaded evidence in real time as Sarah spoke. The response was immediate. Veteran organizations began sharing the broadcast. National news outlets picked up the story. Families with relatives at Liberty Haven flooded social media with questions. Some recognized names from the documents. Others shared stories of relatives who had disappeared years earlier. The investigation exploded across the country within hours. Inside federal offices, alarms went off. The FBI opened an emergency review. The Department of Veterans Affairs launched an immediate investigation. State regulators demanded access to Liberty Haven's records. By late afternoon, federal agents were already coordinating response teams. Back at Liberty Haven, panic spread. Employees watched the broadcast on phones hidden beneath desks. Residents overheard conversations. Family members began arriving at the gates demanding answers. Administrators locked offices and deleted files. Security guards struggled to control growing crowds. Ethan Brooks sat inside his executive office watching everything unfold. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine fear appeared on his face. The carefully constructed empire he spent years building was collapsing in real time. Calls poured into his phone. Lawyers, business partners, investors, politicians. None could stop what was happening. Too many people had seen the evidence. Too many copies existed. Too many agencies were now involved. Ethan slammed a folder onto his desk. Years of manipulation, fraud, and stolen fortunes were unraveling in a single afternoon. Outside, federal vehicles began arriving at Liberty Haven. Reporters gathered near the entrance. Cameras pointed toward the building. The facility descended into chaos. Employees argued. Administrators fled. Families demanded access to loved ones. Meanwhile, Sarah's broadcast continued reaching larger audiences across the country. By evening, millions of people had seen portions of the investigation. Back at the farmhouse, everyone watched events unfold on television. Emily quietly showed Sarah the final records proving Ethan's connection to her mother's missing charity fund. Sarah immediately added the information to the growing case file. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Another crime tied directly to Ethan Brooks. Yet while everyone focused on Liberty Haven, Ethan was already planning his escape. Long before investigators arrived at his office, he had activated contingency plans. Shortly after sunset, a black SUV left Savannah and headed toward a private airfield outside the city. Rain began falling again as darkness settled across the region. Ethan stepped from the vehicle carrying a single briefcase. A private helicopter waited nearby with rotors already spinning. The pilot, a nervous middle-aged man named David Cross, had worked charter flights for years and rarely asked questions. Tonight he sensed trouble but said nothing. Ethan climbed aboard and looked back toward the distant city lights one final time. Behind him, investigations, lawsuits, reporters, and federal agents closed in from every direction. In front of him lay only uncertainty. As the helicopter lifted into the storm, darkened sky, nobody at the farmhouse knew he was already gone. The only thing they knew was that the truth had finally reached the world, and somewhere beyond the clouds, Ethan Brooks was running. The morning after Ethan Brooks disappeared by helicopter, frustration spread throughout the Sullivan farmhouse. Federal agents had arrived at Liberty Haven. The Department of Veterans Affairs had launched emergency investigations. National news channels continued broadcasting updates every hour, yet the man responsible for years of exploitation had vanished. Rain clouds drifted across the Georgia coastline while helicopters and law enforcement vehicles moved throughout the region searching for leads. Inside the farmhouse, Jack Sullivan stood near the window watching federal vehicles come and go from neighboring roads. The evidence recovered from the hidden boathouse had already changed countless lives. But one problem remained. Ethan Brooks was still free. Across the room, Titan lay beside the fireplace. The German Shepherd appeared exhausted after weeks of tracking, searching, and protecting the people around him. Yet whenever Ethan's name appeared in conversation, the dog's ears immediately lifted. Ryan Carter often joked that Titan understood more English than most people. Looking at the old military dog now, nobody laughed. Titan had found the warehouse. Titan had found the boathouse. Titan had uncovered evidence that professional investigators missed. If anyone could help find Ethan, it might be him. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Marcus Hayes spent most of the morning reviewing security footage recovered from businesses near the Savannah waterfront. Hundreds of hours of recordings revealed nothing useful. Then one video caught his attention. A black SUV matching the vehicle used by Ethan appeared briefly near a private aviation service outside the city. Marcus immediately enlarged the footage. The timestamp matched the night Ethan fled. "Jack," Marcus said quietly, "I think I found where he went." Within minutes, everyone gathered around the screen. The video showed Ethan's SUV entering a restricted area connected to a small private airport used primarily by wealthy business owners in charter flights. Ryan leaned closer. If he left by helicopter, somebody there knows where he went. The FBI quickly received the information, but bureaucracy moved slower than desperation. Jack understood that every hour increased the chance Ethan could disappear forever. Before anyone could discuss next steps, Titan stood. The German Shepherd walked toward the evidence table and stopped beside a briefcase recovered from Ethan's office during the federal raid. Agents had allowed temporary access to several items because of the ongoing cooperation between investigators and the Sullivan team. Titan lowered his nose and sniffed carefully. Then he looked toward Jack. A familiar expression appeared in the dog's eyes. Focus, purpose. Jack recognized it immediately. "You have something, don't you?" 2 hours later, Jack, Marcus, Ryan, Luke, and Titan arrived at the private airport. The facility sat outside Savannah, surrounded by fences and open fields. Small jets rested on the tarmac while maintenance crews moved between hangars. The airport manager, a 60-year-old former pilot named Harold Briggs, met them near the entrance. Harold had flown cargo aircraft during his younger years before losing part of his hearing in an accident. The experience made him cautious and observant. After hearing Ethan's name, his expression darkened. "Yeah," Harold admitted. "I remember him." He explained that Ethan had arrived during the storm accompanied by 2 men. A helicopter carried him to a larger private airfield near the state border. Federal agents immediately began coordinating with authorities in neighboring counties, but Titan was already moving. The German Shepherd pulled hard against his leash and headed toward a hangar near the edge of the property. Jack followed. Inside stood several service vehicles and storage containers. Titan ignored them all. He continued moving until reaching a fuel truck parked near the rear exit. There he stopped and barked. Marcus examined the area. Fresh tire tracks led away from the hangar toward a maintenance road rarely used by visitors. "He changed vehicles," Marcus said. The realization spread quickly. Ethan had likely abandoned the helicopter plan after realizing authorities would trace flight records. The helicopter had been a diversion. The real escape continued on the ground. By late afternoon, law enforcement vehicles converged on a remote property near the Georgia border. The location belonged to another shell corporation secretly linked to Ethan's network. Rain began falling again as officers surrounded the estate. Jack remained beside Titan as federal agents moved into position. Then everything happened quickly. A black SUV burst from a garage and accelerated toward the main gate. The driver knew exactly what was happening. Ethan Brooks had run out of places to hide. "That's him," Luke shouted. The SUV tore across the muddy road while law enforcement vehicles moved to intercept. Titan barked furiously. Years seemed to vanish from the old dog's body as pure determination took over. The chase lasted less than 10 minutes. Roadblocks closed every possible route. Eventually, the SUV skidded to a stop near a flooded field. Federal agents surrounded the vehicle. Ethan stepped out slowly with his hands raised. The confident businessman who once controlled millions of dollars looked very different now. His expensive suit was soaked. His face appeared exhausted. For a moment he stared directly at Jack. Then his eyes moved toward Titan. The German Shepherd stood beside the former Navy SEAL, calm and alert. Ethan shook his head bitterly. "A dog," he muttered. "All of this because of a dog." Jack said nothing. Some truths did not require explanations. As agents led Ethan away in handcuffs, a chapter of the investigation finally ended. But another story was beginning. Across Georgia and neighboring states, families started receiving phone calls. Federal investigators used recovered records to locate relatives of veterans who had been isolated, transferred, or hidden within the Liberty Haven system. Some reunions happened immediately. Others required days of coordination. One elderly Navy veteran named Charles Morgan met his daughter for the first time in 7 years after staff falsely told each side the other no longer wished to communicate. Another former Marine was reunited with a grandson he believed had forgotten him. Television crews captured emotional scenes across the region as families embraced loved ones they thought were gone forever. At the center of many of those reunions stood volunteers, social workers, and investigators working tirelessly to repair years of damage. Several days later, Robert Walker received a visitor at the Sullivan farmhouse. Her name was Helen Walker. At 72 years old, Helen carried the same eyes as her older brother. Life had not been easy for her. Years earlier, a misunderstanding involving estate paperwork and false information from Liberty Haven gradually destroyed communication between the siblings. Each believed the other no longer wished to stay in contact. 15 years passed. Neither realized they had both been manipulated. When Helen stepped through the front door, Robert froze. For a moment, neither moved. Then Helen whispered his name. Robert's hands began trembling. Tears filled his eyes. The proud Gulf War veteran who had survived combat, betrayal, and attempted murder suddenly looked like a lost little brother seeing family again. Helen crossed the room and embraced him. Robert buried his face against her shoulder and began to cry. Not because he was weak, not because he was broken, but because after 15 years of silence, loss, and loneliness, his family had finally found its way back to him. 1 year later, spring arrived early across southern Georgia. Warm sunlight danced across fields of wildflowers, while gentle breezes carried the scent of blooming magnolia trees through the countryside. The scars left behind by the Liberty Haven scandal had not completely disappeared, but something remarkable had grown from the pain. Where fear, isolation, and betrayal once thrived, hope had taken root. Along the shoreline of Magnolia Lake, construction crews had spent months transforming a large piece of recovered property into something entirely new. The buildings were bright and welcoming. Walking paths wound through gardens planted by volunteers. Flags representing every branch of military service lined the entrance. Elderly veterans sat on benches overlooking the water while families visited without restrictions, locked doors, or fear. Above the main entrance stood a simple sign, Walker Freedom Center. The name carried deep meaning throughout the community. News of Robert Walker's survival, his courage, and the exposure of Ethan Brooks's operation had spread across the country. Veterans organizations frequently invited him to speak. Schools asked him to share his story. Community groups honored him at events. Yet Robert never seemed comfortable with the attention. At 78 years old, he still preferred quiet conversations to public speeches. What mattered most to him was seeing other veterans receive the care they deserved. This morning, Robert stood beside the lake wearing a navy blue blazer decorated with a small silver star pin. His silver hair had grown longer than before, and while age still showed in his face, there was strength in his posture that had been missing when Jack first found him in the swamp. Nearby, Helen Walker watched proudly. Reuniting with her brother had changed both of their lives. Years of lost time could never be recovered. But they had spent the last year making up for every missed holiday, birthday, and family gathering. Across the property, Emily Sullivan walked through the center carrying a folder beneath one arm. The woman who once struggled beneath crushing debt now managed the rebuilt Walker Veterans Outreach Foundation. After federal investigations recovered stolen funds, much of the money had been returned to the foundation. Emily expanded its programs beyond anything her mother Rachel had originally imagined. Emergency housing assistance, medical support grants, transportation programs, and legal aid services now helped veterans throughout Georgia. The challenges had not disappeared completely, but for the first time since Aaron's death, Emily felt in control of her future. Her mother would have been proud. Nearby, Martha Green, the retired school principal, who helped organize the first fundraiser a year earlier, supervised volunteers preparing refreshments for the day's celebration. The 71-year-old woman remained as energetic as ever, despite insisting she had retired years ago. Some people simply never stopped helping. Inside the main building, Michael Sullivan adjusted his tie nervously, while pretending to focus on event schedules. At 21 years old, he had grown tremendously during the previous year. The investigation had shaped his future in unexpected ways. Working alongside Sarah Collins eventually led him toward investigative journalism. More importantly, it brought Sarah into his life. Sarah stood only a few feet away, speaking with reporters gathered for the opening ceremony. She remained one of the Chronicle's most respected investigative journalists, though her work exposing the Liberty Haven scandal had earned national recognition. Despite the attention, she remained exactly the same person Michael met on his first day at the newspaper. Determined, compassionate, stubborn when necessary, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearance. Michael smiled whenever he looked at her. Across the lawn, a crowd suddenly erupted into applause. Titan had arrived. At 10 years old, the German Shepherd moved a little slower than before. Gray fur now covered much of his muzzle, and years of service had left stiffness in his joints during cold mornings. Yet his eyes remained bright. His loyalty remained unquestionable. Veterans greeted him like an old friend. Children rushed forward asking to pet him. Families posed for photographs beside him. Some people knew every detail of the story. Others simply recognized the dog who had become a symbol of hope. A state representative named Daniel Foster approached the stage carrying a small presentation box. Foster, a former National Guard officer in his late 50s, had spent years advocating for veteran programs after losing close friends during military service. He stepped to the microphone and smiled toward Titan. "Today," he announced, "the state of Georgia wishes to recognize extraordinary service." The crowd immediately understood. Applause echoed across the property. Foster opened the box and revealed a special medal created to honor Titan's role in uncovering the Liberty Haven crimes. Cameras flashed as Jack guided the German Shepherd onto the stage. Titan seemed far more interested in greeting people than participating in ceremonies, causing laughter throughout the audience. Even Jack couldn't hide a smile. The medal was gently attached to Titan's harness. For a moment the crowd stood and applauded. Some veterans saluted. Others wiped away tears, because they understood what the dog represented: loyalty, courage, the refusal to abandon someone in need. Later that afternoon, after speeches ended and visitors explored the center, Michael finally found the courage he had been gathering for months. Near the lake shore beneath a large magnolia tree, he asked Sarah to take a walk. She immediately noticed his nervous expression. "You're acting strange," she said. Michael laughed. "I've been acting strange all day." The lake reflected golden sunlight while gentle ripples moved across the water. After several awkward attempts to find the right words, Michael finally stopped walking. He reached into his pocket. Sarah's eyes widened. "Michael," he smiled, "you spent a year helping expose corruption, save lives, and make the world a better place." His voice shook slightly. "I figured maybe you could put up with me too." Sarah laughed through tears. The answer came before he finished asking. Families nearby cheered when they realized what had happened. Even Titan barked once, as if offering approval. As evening approached, the grand opening ceremony reached its final moments. Guests gathered beside Magnolia Lake, while the sun slowly descended toward the horizon. Golden light reflected across the water. Veterans sat with their families. Volunteers shared stories. children played along the shoreline. It looked nothing like Liberty Haven, nothing like fear, nothing like isolation. Robert Walker stepped forward carrying a folded American flag. The fabric appeared worn with age but carefully preserved. He approached Jack. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then Robert placed the flag into Jack's hands. "I carried this during the Gulf War," he said quietly. Jack looked down at the flag. The gesture clearly meant more than words could express. Robert smiled. His eyes reflected the setting sun. "People think you saved me that night in the swamp." His voice carried across the quiet shoreline. Titan sat beside Jack, watching him. Robert looked at the old German shepherd and smiled again. "But the truth is, you and Titan saved a lot of people we've never even met." Silence settled over the crowd, not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when everyone understands something important. Jack looked around. Veterans reunited with families, volunteers helping strangers, children laughing without understanding how close some of these people came to disappearing forever. Then he looked at Titan. The old German shepherd sat proudly beside him, gazing across Magnolia Lake as if everything were perfectly normal. Perhaps to him it was. The sun finally touched the horizon. Golden light painted the water, while magnolia blossoms swayed gently in the evening breeze. Together, Jack Sullivan, Robert Walker, and Titan stood overlooking the lake. Behind them stood a home for veterans who once had nowhere to go. Ahead of them stretched a future built from courage, friendship, and second chances. And as darkness slowly settled across the peaceful shoreline, it became clear that the greatest miracle had never been exposing a criminal or recovering stolen fortunes. The real miracle was that people who refused to give up on one another had changed countless lives forever.